The fluorescent lights in Roosevelt Elementary's main office hummed with the kind of persistent drone that made Claire Morrison's headache worse. She'd been cleaning hotel rooms since 5 that morning, had picked up a lunch shift at the diner, and still had her evening bartending job ahead of her before she could collapse into bed for a few hours of sleep. The last thing she needed was a call from her son's school asking her to come in immediately for an urgent matter regarding 7-year-old Danny's behavior. Claire shifted in the uncomfortable plastic chair outside Principal Henderson's office, her hands folded in her lap to hide the redness and cracks from constant exposure to cleaning chemicals. Through the office window, she could see Danny sitting at a small table in the conference room, his dark hair falling across his forehead as he stared down at his hands with the particular stillness of a child who knew he was in serious trouble, but didn't quite understand why. The door to the principal's office opened, and Mrs. Henderson emerged with Danny's art teacher, Miss Reeves, whose usually cheerful demeanor had been replaced by an expression somewhere between concern and barely concealed fear. Behind them came a woman Claire didn't recognize, sharply dressed in a way that suggested either lawyer or social worker, neither of which boded well for this meeting. "Ms. Morrison, thank you for coming so quickly." Principal Henderson's voice carried the professional warmth that couldn't quite mask underlying tension. "Please come in. We need to discuss something Danny created in art class today." Claire followed them into the conference room, where Danny looked up with eyes that were simultaneously defiant and scared. She wanted to go to him immediately, to wrap him in her arms and promise that whatever this was, they'd handle it together. But the adult's body language suggested she needed to understand the situation first. On the table lay a piece of drawing paper, and Claire's breath caught as she recognized her son's careful pencil work. Danny had always been artistic, spending hours sketching while she worked her various jobs, teaching himself techniques from library books because they couldn't afford proper art classes. But this drawing was different from his usual superheroes and dragons. It was a portrait of a man, rendered with surprising skill for a 7-year-old, showing someone middle-aged with distinctive features, sharp cheekbones, a slightly crooked nose that suggested it had been broken at some point, and eyes that even in pencil sketch seemed to hold a particular intensity. The detail was remarkable, from the texture of the man's hair to the subtle lines around his eyes. It looked like someone Danny had studied closely, repeatedly, until every feature was memorized. "Ms. Morrison," Principal Henderson began carefully, "Danny drew this during free art time today. When Miss Reeves asked him about it, he said it was someone he sees sometimes, someone who—" She paused, choosing words carefully. "Someone who watches your apartment building." Claire's stomach dropped. "What?" "He said the man sits in a car across the street," Miss Reeves added, her voice trembling slightly. "That he's been there for weeks, that sometimes the man waves at Danny through the window." The sharp-dressed woman leaned forward, and Claire finally placed her, Detective Sarah Chen from the local precinct. "Ms. Morrison, do you recognize this person?" Claire studied the drawing more carefully, her heart hammering against her ribs. The face was unfamiliar, but something about it triggered an instinctive fear. "No, I've never seen him before. Danny, is this true? There's a man watching our building?" Danny nodded, his small voice barely audible. "He's there most mornings when I look out the window before school, and sometimes at night. He doesn't do anything bad, Mom. He just sits there. Once, when I waved, he waved back." The room went very quiet. Detective Chen pulled out her phone, scrolling through images before stopping on one and showing it to Claire. "Is this the building where you live?" Claire nodded, recognizing the tired 4-story walk-up in a neighborhood that was affordable because it was one step above dangerous. The photograph showed the street view, including the spot where a car might park with clear sightlines to their third-floor apartment. "We need you to take this very seriously, Ms. Morrison." Detective Chen's tone was professional but urgent. "A child's detailed drawing of an unknown adult who's been conducting surveillance on your residence is extremely concerning. Have you noticed anything unusual? Anyone following you? Strange phone calls? Any indication that someone might have a specific interest in you or your son?" Claire's mind raced through the past few weeks, searching for anything out of the ordinary in a life that was already stressful enough without adding stalkers to the mix. No, nothing. I work 3 jobs just to keep us fed and housed. I don't have time for. She stopped, a memory surfacing. Wait! About a month ago, Danny came home from the playground saying a man had asked him questions. What his name was, where he went to school. I told him never to talk to strangers and thought that was the end of it. Did Danny describe this man? Detective Chen was already taking notes. He said the man had gray hair and smiled a lot, that he seemed nice. Claire looked at her son, seeing him with new eyes. Vulnerable, innocent, utterly unprepared for the kind of danger that apparently existed in the world beyond her ability to protect him from. Danny, why didn't you tell me about the man in the car? You're always tired, Mom. Danny's voice was small, and the truth of it cut deeper than any accusation could have. I didn't want to worry you, and he never tried to hurt me. He just watches. I thought maybe he was like the security guard at your hotel. Keeping people safe. The logic of a 7-year-old trying to make sense of something sinister by fitting it into a framework of benevolence. Claire felt simultaneously proud of his attempt to be considerate and horrified by what his silence might have allowed to continue. Principal Henderson cleared her throat. Ms. Morrison, we're going to need to implement additional security measures for Danny at school. No one except you or someone on your approved list will be allowed to pick him up. We're also recommending you file a formal police report and consider whether your current living situation is safe. Consider whether. Claire's voice rose despite her efforts to stay calm. I can barely afford where we live now. Do you have any idea what it costs to move? First month, last month, security deposit, moving expenses? I'm one unexpected expense away from being homeless. I can't just pack up and leave because some man is sitting in a car on a public street. The adults exchanged looks that Claire had learned to interpret over 7 years of single motherhood. The look that said her life was complicated in ways that made other people uncomfortable, that her poverty created problems they couldn't solve with their middle-class solutions. We understand this is difficult, Detective Chen said carefully. But Ms. Morrison, we need to determine who this person is and what his intentions might be. The fact that he's been conducting surveillance on a single mother and her young son for weeks is extremely concerning. It could be anything from a custody issue to. She paused, clearly deciding not to complete that sentence in front of Danny. There is no custody issue. Claire's voice was flat. Danny's father left before he was born. He signed away his rights and hasn't contacted us in 7 years. He doesn't even know what Danny looks like now. Could it be a relative? Someone from the father's side who. No. Claire was certain about this. His family wanted nothing to do with us. Made that very clear when I was pregnant. This is someone else. Detective Chen pulled out a business card, sliding it across the table. I'm going to need you to come to the station and give a formal statement. We'll also want to canvass your neighborhood, see if anyone else has noticed this vehicle or individual. In the meantime, I strongly suggest varying your routines. Different routes to school, different times when possible. And, Ms. Morrison? She paused until Claire met her eyes. If you see this man, do not approach him. Call 911 immediately. An hour later, Claire and Danny sat in their apartment, the space feeling suddenly smaller and less safe than it had that morning. She'd called in sick to her evening shift, losing money she couldn't afford to lose, because the thought of leaving Danny with their neighbor Mrs. Park while someone might be watching their building was unbearable. Danny had been quiet since they left the school, his usual chatter replaced by a stillness that made him seem older than 7. Now he sat at their small kitchen table, mechanically eating the mac and cheese she'd made for dinner, his eyes occasionally drifting to the window, where the curtains were now firmly closed. I'm sorry, Mom. His voice was barely audible. I didn't mean to cause trouble. Claire moved to sit beside him, pulling him into a hug that he returned with fierce intensity. You didn't cause trouble, baby. You did exactly right by drawing that picture. It helped the adults understand that something might be wrong. I'm the one who's sorry. For what? For so many things, Claire thought. For working so much that he didn't feel he could tell her about a man watching their building. For being so exhausted that she hadn't noticed the changes in his behavior that must have preceded today's revelation. For the poverty that kept them living in a neighborhood where surveillance and danger were just part of the landscape. For not being around enough to notice something was worrying you, she said instead. Danny pulled back to look at her, with eyes that held far too much understanding for his age. You work hard so we can have food and our apartment. I know that. The other kids at school, their parents complain about stuff like which restaurant to go to, or whether their vacation is long enough. You don't complain, you just work. The observation was delivered without self-pity, just a child's clear-eyed assessment of his reality. It made Claire's chest tight with a mixture of pride and grief. Pride that she'd raised someone so perceptive and empathetic. Grief that he'd had to develop those qualities through hardship rather than security. Well, I'm here now, she said firmly. And we're going to figure this out together. No more secrets about things that worry you, okay? I don't care how tired I am. If something feels wrong, you tell me immediately. Danny nodded, then hesitated. Mom? The man in the car. He didn't feel dangerous. I know that sounds weird, but he looked sad more than scary. Like he was watching us because he wanted to, not because he wanted to hurt us. Claire filed this observation away to mention to Detective Chen, even as her parental instincts screamed that no adult had innocent reasons for surveilling a child. Even if he's not dangerous, Danny, it's not okay for strange adults to watch children without their parents knowing. That's why we have rules about strangers. They spent the evening playing board games and reading, activities that kept them away from the windows and distracted from the fear that had taken up residence in their small apartment. Claire checked the locks 3 times before bed, wedged a chair under the doorknob the way she'd seen in movies, and lay awake long after Danny had finally fallen asleep in her bed, a concession to the fear she could see in his eyes when she'd tried to send him to his own room. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by sounds that might have been normal building noises, but now seemed sinister. Every car door, every footstep in the hallway, every creak of settling wood sent her heart racing. She found herself mentally cataloging exits, emergency plans, ways to protect Danny if someone tried to force their way in. The next morning arrived with the kind of exhaustion that felt like physical weight. Claire got Danny ready for school with extra vigilance, scanning the street from behind their curtains before allowing him to step outside. The car Danny had described, a dark sedan, ordinary enough to be invisible, wasn't there. She wasn't sure if that made her feel better or worse. At the school drop-off, she spoke directly with Principal Henderson again, confirming that the new security protocols were in place. She watched Danny walk through the doors with a security guard visibly checking him in, and only then did she allow herself to breathe slightly easier. Her phone rang as she was walking to the bus stop for her hotel shift. Detective Chen's name flashed on the screen. Ms. Morrison, I wanted to update you on our investigation. We've reviewed the drawing with several colleagues and... She paused, and Claire heard something new in her voice. Not fear exactly, but a heightened alertness. The person your son drew matches someone in our database. His name is Antonio Rossi. He's connected to the Castellano crime family. The words hit Claire like cold water. Crime family? You mean like the Mafia? Organized crime, yes. Rossi is a known associate. Not high level, but definitely part of their organization. Detective Chen's voice was carefully controlled. Ms. Morrison, I need to ask you some very direct questions. Is there any possibility that you or someone in your family has connections to organized crime? Any debts, any relationships, any past involvement that might explain why someone from that world would be interested in you or your son? No. Claire's voice was definitive. I've spent my entire adult life working legitimate jobs and trying to give my son a normal childhood. I don't know anyone involved in that kind of thing. What about Danny's father? Could he have had connections you weren't aware of? Claire thought about Marcus, charming, irresponsible Marcus, who'd promised her the world and then disappeared when pregnancy became reality. He was a bartender and sometime musician. He couldn't hold down a real job, which is why I ended things. But organized crime? No. He was too disorganized for anything that required actual planning. Detective Chen was quiet for a moment. Ms. Morrison, there's something else. We checked recent police reports from your neighborhood. 3 weeks ago, there was an incident 2 blocks from your building. Attempted mugging interrupted by an unidentified man who intervened and scared off the attackers. The victim, a young mother with a child, gave a description that roughly matches Antonio Rossi. Did you hear about this incident? No, but I'm not usually home to hear neighborhood gossip. I'm always working. The victim said her child was the same age as hers, and that the man asked if she lived in the area, if she needed help getting home safely. She declined and he left, but she remembered him as being very concerned about whether anyone else was watching her. Claire felt something shift in her understanding. You think he's protecting us, not threatening us? I think we need to determine what his actual interest is before making any assumptions. Detective Chen's professional tone returned. In the meantime, we've increased patrols in your area. If Rossi appears again, we want to bring him in for questioning. After ending the call, Claire stood at the bus stop trying to process this new information. A member of organized crime was watching her son, but possibly protecting rather than threatening him? It made no sense. She had no connection to that world, no reason anyone from it would have interest in her or Danny. The day passed in a blur of anxious distraction. Claire scrubbed hotel bathrooms while her mind churned through possibilities, each more far-fetched than the last. By the time she picked up Danny from school, with the new security measures making the process take twice as long, she felt wound tight enough to snap. That evening, as she was preparing dinner in their small kitchen, Danny called out from the living room, where he'd been doing homework. "Mom! The man is back!" Claire's heart stopped. She moved quickly to the window, careful to stay hidden behind the curtain as she peered out. There, parked in the same spot Danny had described, sat a dark sedan. And behind the wheel, barely visible in the gathering dusk, sat a man whose profile matched the drawing that had started all of this. Her phone was in her hand immediately, Detective Chen's number already dialing. "He's here," she said as soon as the detective answered. "The man, Rossi. He's parked outside right now. Don't approach him. We have units in the area. They'll be there in 3 minutes." Claire kept watching as police cars converged on her street from both directions, as the sedan's driver became aware of the trap closing around him, as the man who'd been watching her son for weeks finally stepped out of his car, with his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. Even from 3 stories up, she could see his face clearly, the same features Danny had captured in his drawing, but with an expression she hadn't expected. Not menace or calculation, but something that looked almost like resignation mixed with relief, as if he'd been waiting for this confrontation, as if part of him welcomed it. "Stay here," Claire told Danny firmly. "Stay away from the windows, and do not come down no matter what you hear. Promise me." "I promise, but Mom, where are you going?" "To get answers." She took the stairs 2 at a time, emerging onto the street just as Detective Chen was placing handcuffs on Antonio Rossi. The man didn't resist, didn't argue, just stood with a stillness that suggested he'd been in this position before. But when his eyes found Claire pushing through the small crowd that had gathered, his expression shifted into something that made her breath catch. It was recognition, not the recognition of a stalker seeing his target, but something deeper, more fundamental. The kind of recognition that came with history, with connection, with knowledge that shouldn't exist between strangers. "You don't remember me," Rossi said, his voice carrying clearly despite the chaos around him. "But I remember you, and I remember what I owe your family." "I don't know you," Claire said, but uncertainty crept into her voice. "Not me directly, but your father," Rossi's eyes held hers steadily. Anthony Morrison. He saved my life 25 years ago, and I've spent every day since trying to honor that debt. The name hit Claire like a physical blow. Anthony Morrison. Her father, dead for 20 years. A man she barely remembered, except in fragments and photographs. My father died when I was 7. I don't remember much about him. He was a good man. Rossi's voice softened. He didn't know what I was involved in. He just saw someone in trouble and helped without asking questions. By the time I learned he'd died, you and your mother had already moved away. It took me years to find you again. Detective Chen stepped forward. Mr. Rossi, you have the right to remain silent. I know my rights, Detective, and I'm waiving them. I'll answer any questions she has. His focus remained on Claire. Your mother moved you around a lot after your father died. Different cities, different schools. I lost track of you for years. When I finally found you again 6 months ago, I learned you were struggling. Single mother, working multiple jobs, barely making rent. I wanted to help, but I knew direct contact would only complicate your life. So you started watching us? Claire's voice rose. You terrified my son? You made us feel unsafe in our own home? I was making sure you were safe. Rossi's expression didn't change. Your neighborhood isn't exactly secure. There have been 3 attempted break-ins in your building this year, 2 muggings on your street. I made sure none of them touched you or your son. I made sure the dealers who worked the corner knew that apartment was off limits. I made sure— You made sure by stalking a child? Detective Chen interjected. Mr. Rossi, whatever your intentions, your actions constitute harassment at minimum, potentially stalking, potentially conspiracy to— To what? Protect them? Rossi's voice carried frustration now. I owe a debt to a dead man who saved my life when he had no reason to. His daughter is struggling to survive in a neighborhood I know is dangerous, because I know the people who make it dangerous. I have the resources to protect her, so I did. Was I supposed to just ignore the debt because direct contact might be inconvenient? Claire felt the ground shifting beneath her understanding. What debt? What did my father do? Rossi looked at her for a long moment, then at Detective Chen. Can we speak privately? There are things about that night that— He trailed off, something complicated crossing his face. Anything you say to Ms. Morrison can be said in front of me, Detective Chen stated firmly. Fine. Rossi's jaw tightened. 25 years ago, I was a different person. Young, stupid, thinking I could climb the ranks of my organization by taking risks others wouldn't. I got caught in a situation that went wrong. I was injured, bleeding out in an alley, and your father found me. He was just walking home from his night shift at the factory. He could have kept walking. Most people would have. I was clearly involved in something illegal. The gunshot wound made that obvious. But he stopped. He called an ambulance. He stayed with me until they arrived. He told the police I was just a robbery victim, gave a description of fake attackers that led them away from the truth. He saved my life twice that night, once by keeping me alive, once by keeping me out of prison. Claire tried to reconcile this story with the father she barely remembered. A quiet man who'd worked long hours and died young of a heart attack that the doctors said came from undiagnosed congenital defect. She'd always thought of him as ordinary, unremarkable, except in his absence. I tried to thank him, Rossi continued. Sent money anonymously, tried to find ways to help without revealing what I was. But he died before I could really repay him. So that debt transferred to you. His daughter. His legacy. I don't want anything from your world, Claire said, her voice steadier than she felt. I don't want protection bought with blood money. I don't want my son growing up thinking that's how the world works. Your son already knows how the world works. Rossi's voice was gentle but firm. He drew my picture because he's observant and smart. He noticed I was watching because he's been trained by circumstances to be vigilant. You've raised him to be aware, to be careful, to understand that danger exists. I'm just making sure that danger doesn't reach him. Detective Chen's radio crackled with activity. She stepped away to respond, leaving Claire and Rossi in a bubble of strange intimacy despite the handcuffs and the crowd and the circumstances. My father wouldn't want this, Claire said quietly. If he was the man you describe, someone who helped without expecting anything in return, he wouldn't want you to feel obligated to watch over us like we're some kind of sacred trust. Maybe not, Rossi allowed, but I'm not doing this because I think he'd want me to. I'm doing it because I want to. Because you're a good mother working yourself to exhaustion to give your son a better life. Because that kid up there is exactly the kind of person the world needs more of. Smart, kind, creative. Because I have the power to make your lives a little bit safer, and not using that power when I could feels like a greater crime than anything I've done in my organization. Detective Chen returned, her expression troubled. Mr. Rossi, we're going to need to take you in for formal questioning. Ms. Morrison, I'll need you to come to the station as well to give an official statement. Am I under arrest? Rossi asked calmly. That depends on Ms. Morrison's willingness to press charges for the surveillance and whether we can connect you to any other crimes during your protective activities. Claire looked at this man who'd apparently been shadowing her life for weeks, who claimed to be honoring a debt to a father she barely remembered, who'd made her son feel unsafe even while trying to keep them protected. Every rational instinct said to let the law handle this, to press charges, to establish legal boundaries between her family and this man's dangerous world. But she couldn't shake the memory of Danny's observation. He looked sad more than scary, like he was watching us because he wanted to, not because he wanted to hurt us. I need to think about this, Claire said finally. But Mr. Rossi, you need to understand something. If you want to honor my father's memory, you do it by staying away from my son. You don't watch him. You don't follow him. You don't insert yourself into his life. If you truly want to help, you find ways that don't make a 7-year-old boy afraid. He's afraid because he doesn't understand. Rossi's voice carried urgency now. Let me explain to him. You don't get to decide what my child understands. Claire's voice was steel. That's my choice, my responsibility, not yours. Detective Chen began leading Rossi toward the police car, but he turned back one more time. The debt is real, Ms. Morrison, whether you accept it or not, and there are things coming that you should know about. Mr. Rossi, that's enough. Detective Chen cut him off. Anything else can be discussed at the station. Claire stood on the sidewalk, watching as the police cars pulled away, aware of her neighbors watching from windows, of Danny probably pressing his face against the glass despite her instructions to stay back. She felt the weight of decisions she didn't want to make, of connections she didn't want to have, of a world she'd worked so hard to keep separate from her own. When she returned to the apartment, Danny was indeed at the window, his drawing from school clutched in his hand. Is he in trouble? The watching man? Yes, Claire said honestly. What he was doing wasn't okay, even if he thought he had good reasons. But he knew Grandpa Anthony? The grandpa I never met? Claire knelt to be at eye level with her son, taking his hands in hers. That's what he says. I don't know if it's true. But Danny, even if it is true, that doesn't mean he gets to be part of our lives. We don't owe him anything. But if Grandpa saved his life, isn't that like a big deal? In the stories, when someone saves someone else's life, they become connected forever. The simplicity of childhood logic, seeing the world in terms of stories and rules that made sense. Real life is more complicated than stories, Claire said gently. Sometimes people who want to help actually make things worse. Sometimes the right thing to do is to keep distance, even from people who think they're trying to protect you. Danny considered this, his young face serious. Are we safe now? Is he going to stop watching? Yes, Claire said, with more certainty than she felt. He's going to stop. The next few days passed in a strange limbo. Rossi was released after 48 hours. Detective Chen explained that without clear evidence of criminal intent, and with Claire declining to press charges for the surveillance, they couldn't hold him. But there was a restraining order now, legal boundaries that made his continued watching illegal rather than just disturbing. The car didn't reappear on their street. Claire checked multiple times a day, but the spot where Rossi had parked remained empty. She should have felt relieved. Instead, she felt oddly exposed, as if the protection she hadn't wanted and didn't ask for had nevertheless been real, and its absence left them vulnerable in ways she couldn't quite articulate. A week after Rossi's arrest, Claire returned home from her hotel shift to find an envelope tucked into their apartment door. No name, no return address, just a standard manila envelope that could have come from anywhere. She brought it inside, checked it thoroughly for anything suspicious, then finally opened it with trembling hands. Inside was a cashier's check for $50,000 and a note written in careful handwriting. "This is not blood money. It's the legitimate proceeds from investments your father helped me make 25 years ago. Money he refused when he was alive because he didn't want anything from me. But it's his money, earned through advice he gave me about basic financial planning when I was young and stupid. It's been growing in an account under his name all these years. It belongs to you. It belongs to his grandson. Use it for something that would make Anthony Morrison proud. And know that whether you accept this or not, whether you ever think of me again or not, I will honor my debt by ensuring you and your son live safely. You won't see me, won't know I'm there, but I will be watching. Not because I expect gratitude, because I owe a man who saved my life when he had no reason to, and the only way I know how to repay that debt is to protect what he loved most. His family." Claire stared at the check, at the amount that could change her life, could pay for a safer apartment, could buy Danny those art classes he'd never had, could create a buffer against the constant financial crisis that defined their existence. She thought about her father, about whether he would want her to accept this money, whether he would see it as honoring his memory or compromising the values he'd lived by. She thought about Antonio Rossi, about a man trapped by loyalty to someone long dead, about the weight of debts that couldn't be fully repaid, about the complicated morality of protection offered by dangerous people. And she thought about Danny, asleep in his room, still drawing pictures, but now of superheroes and dragons again, the fear slowly fading as the man in the car remained absent from their street. The next day, Claire took the envelope to Detective Chen. "I want to know if this is legitimate, if it really came from legal investments like the note claims, if it's clean money." Detective Chen examined the check, made calls to financial institutions, ran traces that took 3 days to complete. When she finally called Claire back, her voice carried a note of surprise. "It checks out, Ms. Morrison. The account exists, has existed for 24 years, and is indeed registered under your father's name. The investments are documented, all legitimate holdings that have grown over time. There's no connection to any criminal enterprise that we can find. As far as we can determine, this money is exactly what Rossi claimed, proceeds from legal investments your father advised him to make." "So I can't accept it?" Claire's voice was small. "Legally, yes. Morally? That's a question only you can answer." That night, Claire sat with Danny and told him a story about his grandfather Anthony, about a man who'd seen someone in trouble and helped without asking questions, without expecting reward, just because it was the right thing to do. She told him about how sometimes kindness created connections that lasted long after the kind person was gone, how debts of gratitude could shape entire lives. "Is that why the watching man was protecting us?" Danny asked. "Because Grandpa was kind to him?" "Yes," Claire said. "But Danny, I need you to understand something important. Just because someone wants to help doesn't mean we have to accept that help. We get to decide who's part of our lives. We get to set boundaries about what kind of help we're comfortable with." "But we're keeping the money?" Danny's perceptiveness was unsettling sometimes. "We're considering it," Claire corrected. "And if we do, we're using it to build something your grandfather would be proud of. Better education for you, a safer place to live, maybe even something that helps other people the way your grandfather helped Mr. Rossi." She deposited the check 2 days later, after consulting with a financial advisor recommended by Detective Chen, after setting up accounts that would protect the money and allow it to grow for Danny's future. And she used part of it immediately to move them to a better neighborhood, to enroll Danny in the art program he'd always wanted, to reduce her work schedule enough that she could actually be present in her son's life. She never saw Antonio Rossi again, but sometimes, when she and Danny were walking to his new school in their new neighborhood, she'd catch a glimpse of a dark sedan parked at a distance, or notice someone in the crowd who seemed to be watching them with benign attentiveness. And she'd think about her father, about debts that transcended death, about the complicated morality of accepting help from dangerous people. Danny stopped drawing pictures of the watching man, but his art improved dramatically with proper instruction. His teachers praised his talent, suggested he might have a real future in it. And when Claire looked at his new sketches, still superheroes and dragons, but now rendered with professional skill, she thought about Antonio Rossi's words. That kid is exactly the kind of person the world needs more of. A year later, Claire received another envelope, this time delivered by courier to her new apartment. Inside was a newspaper clipping about Antonio Rossi's death, killed in what the article vaguely described as an incident related to organized crime activity. And attached was another note. The arrangements have been made. Trust established in your son's name, managed by legitimate trustees, completely severed from any criminal enterprise. He'll have access when he turns 18. Enough for college, for art school, for whatever future he chooses. This is the last you'll hear from me or my world. The debt is paid. Your father would be proud of the man his grandson is becoming. A.R. Claire showed Danny the article, explained that the watching man was gone, that they were safe not because someone dangerous was protecting them, but because they'd built a life strong enough to stand on its own. But that night, she sat with the newspaper clipping and thought about complicated legacies, about kindness that rippled through decades, about her father, who'd saved a stranger's life, without knowing how that single act would shape his daughter's future and his grandson's prospects. She thought about Antonio Rossi, trapped by loyalty to a man he'd known for one brief encounter, spending 25 years trying to repay a debt that could never really be satisfied. And she thought about the money that would send Danny to art school someday, bought with investments her father had suggested, protected by a criminal who'd spent his life honoring one moment of grace. It was messy and complicated, and ethically ambiguous in ways that would never fit neatly into categories of right and wrong. But it was also real. And maybe that was the truth her father had understood that night in the alley 25 years ago. That people were complicated, that kindness could come from unexpected places, that sometimes the right choice was to help without asking too many questions about where that help might lead. Danny would grow up with opportunities Claire had never imagined providing. He'd become an artist, would create beauty that touched people's lives, would carry forward his grandfather's legacy of seeing people clearly and acting with compassion. And he'd do it with resources that came from a tangled web of debt and gratitude and protection offered by a man from a world Claire had never wanted to touch. Years later, when Danny asked her about the trust fund that paid for his education, Claire would tell him the truth, all of it, complicated and messy and real. And she'd watch her son process this information with the same clear-eyed perception he'd shown at 7, understanding that people and situations rarely fit into neat categories, that debts of gratitude could transcend death and morality, that protection could come from unexpected sources. "Do you think Grandpa would have wanted this?" Danny would ask. "Would he have wanted Mr. Rossi to spend his life feeling obligated?" "I don't know," Claire would answer honestly, "but I think he would have wanted you to have opportunities, and I think he would have understood that sometimes we accept complicated help from imperfect people because the alternative is letting pride prevent us from building better futures." And Danny would nod, understanding in the way children of single mothers learn to understand. That survival sometimes meant accepting help you didn't want from sources you didn't choose, and that didn't make you weak or complicit. just human and practical, and focused on building something better than what you'd been given. The watching man was gone, but his protection remained embedded in the infrastructure of their lives, and Claire had learned to live with that paradox, grateful and uncomfortable in equal measure, accepting and questioning simultaneously, building a future shaped by a past she'd never known about, honoring her father's memory by using resources that came from his single moment of grace toward a stranger in an alley. It wasn't the story she'd have chosen, but it was the story she'd been given, and she'd learned, slowly and painfully, that sometimes the most important choice wasn't between right and wrong, but between accepting imperfect help or struggling alone. And for Danny's sake, for the future that stretched ahead of him full of possibility, she'd chosen to accept. The debt was paid. The protection remained. And Anthony Morrison's legacy lived on in ways he could never have imagined, rippling forward through his grandson's talent and his daughter's resilience, and a criminal's unwavering loyalty to a man who'd shown him kindness when he least deserved it. That, Claire thought, was perhaps the truest thing about grace. It rarely made sense, rarely fit into tidy moral categories, but its effects could reshape entire lives across decades. Her father had taught her that without words, through a single choice made in an alley 25 years before, she'd understand its significance. And now she was teaching Danny the same lesson, watching him grow into someone who understood that the world was complicated, that people were more than their worst choices, that protection and danger could coexist in the same gesture, and that sometimes the right thing to do was accept imperfect help with clear-eyed gratitude and use it to build something worthy of the complicated grace that made it possible.